amazing thing, really. We're now going to item 17, which is the establishment of the Auckland Future Fund. I'm going to move this. Councillor Fletcher, would you like to second this, please?
Yes, I'm happy to do so.
Thank you very much. Councillor Fletcher and the Investments Working Party made the recommendation of a future fund back last year, and we've spent a lot of time discussing the fund and how we can protect it for the future. I've been clear that the establishment of the future fund and the protection mechanisms need to be as strong as possible. It also reflects the clear direction from Council as to protect the real value of the fund over time and provide strong returns to Council to fund services and infrastructure. There are many layers of protection: the trust deed, the investment policies, categorising it as a strategic asset, and the local bill over the top of all that. Our legal team and my office have spoken with a government MP about sponsoring local bill, and he's keen to do it. And I have the Prime Minister's agreement to support it as well. So I hope we can get on quickly with this. I'd welcome Ross and Nicola. There are some very long recommendations here which reflect decisions we made last month. So you're going to talk to us on this. We've made particular care to carefully read what we passed and to make sure this absolutely reflects it. There's an additional recommendation to provide progress updates on the establishment of the fund of the government governing body. This is in response to the question about reporting raised at Tuesday's Performance and Appointments Committee. Just a note for councillors, if you have it a minute, please share it in writing and make sure it's balanced. Rightio, I'm going to ask Ross and Nicola to address us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. As the Mayor's noted, there are some long, detailed recommendations here, and there have been some changes to what's proposed that were worked through a workshop last week, or as a result of feedback from workshop last week and through that Performance and Appointments Review Committee. So I thought it was just helpful just to have a few slides just to make sure you understand the recommendations and some of those things that have moved around based on your feedback. If we can... Okay, so the context here, 19th of June, there was a workshop on this, and there was some feedback given on what was proposed, the direction that we were travelling in terms of preparing these reports, recommendations, and in particular around some of the protections. The first item around, one of the things raised was governance appointments around the number and who the directors of the trustee company might be. That is something that was addressed at that Performance and Appointments Committee. So that was the place to address it, and discussions have been had through that and decisions made in relation to that. So I won't go into that here, but these four items were covered in a memo that went out to you last Friday. There was information there. That one's been dealt with. The second thing that was covered in that workshop and in that memo was around responsible investment policy. There was question marks there about whether certain exclusions, so types of assets that the policy asks us to avoid, asks the council group to avoid, why were those things omitted from the policy? At the time, we weren't quite sure. We had to go do a bit of digging. What we discovered is there are actually two responsible investment policies, one relating to the older diversified financial assets portfolio, another one relating to the self-insurance portfolio, self-insurance fund, which is more recent. So we've looked at the two different policies, looked at what are the range of exclusions, and taken the most restrictive version of the two policies to reflect that into the one that is on the agenda today. So you'll see that the things there, in particular, excluding investments in the industries that profit from gambling and avoiding investing in fossil fuels, are now included as things to be avoided in the latest draft of this policy that's we're asking you to approve today. Another key thing was the protection. What are those? Have we got the right protections? Have we got the strictest possible protections around the real value of that fund? And there's a range of things there, and I'll get Nicola to talk about that in due course. One of the key things in that was around the distributions policy and around having these what we call exceptional distributions. And so we've reflected on that, listened to the feedback and thought about, well, what is including or excluding that? Does it give you stronger or weaker protection? And we've made some changes based on that. Essentially, what we've done is removed that, any comment around exceptional distributions from the policy, and that was in the LTP that you've adopted. But in the trust deed, we've retained those things because the view is retaining it in the trust deed gives you better protection than if you don't include it. The last point was around are there any lessons to be learnt from the New Plymouth example, where there is an existing bit of legislation in place, and we've gone away, we've had a look at that, and we've had the internal and external legal teams review that legislation, review the draft that we've got for the Auckland legislation, and looked at how does that relate to the trust deed we're proposing, and is there anything to be learnt from that? What we've kind of discovered by looking through that is we think we can do even better than the New Plymouth legislation. We think that the combination of the trust deed and looking at the context and the protections that you're trying to establish, we think we've got something that's even stronger than the New Plymouth one. So we think we've learnt all of the lessons, and we've got that legislation combined with the trust deed to give you the maximum protection. So we don't think there's anything further to change. One more slide from me. This is just a reminder of the policy framework. So what are the different bits and policies? So there's a bunch of policies that were in the LTP that you've just adopted. The blue ones are the two new ones. So there's an AFF, Auckland Future Fund policy, and the distribution policy in the LTP. There's also amendments to the CCO accountability policy and the Auckland Airport shareholding policy. So existing policies, but have been modified and updated to enable you to proceed with the future fund as proposed. So that left-hand box has been already approved and adopted. The middle box is what we're asking you to approve and endorse as part of these recommendations, and that's to approve a draft trust deed, this responsible investment policy I just spoke about, and also delegate to the Chief Executive to go ahead and change a significant engagement policy, and that basically captures the fact that the Auckland Future Fund will be designated as a strategic asset. So because it is designated as a strategic asset, that policy needs to be updated to reflect that. There's a bunch of other things on the right-hand side, the SIPO, governance policy, risk management policies, and statements of intent. Those are all things that need to be prepared by the trustee. Once the trustee is established and directors appointed, those will be live things that happen later on with those directors. So it's just identifying those as part of that overall framework, but they will happen a little bit later. So with that, I'll pass across to Nicola to talk about some of the other elements.
Thanks, Ross. Kia ora, everybody. So we have spent some time obviously thinking about the protection mechanisms in place, and these are a range of things that work together in concert. Ross has just mentioned the categorisation of the fund as a strategic asset. What this does is provide the highest level of protection that's available under the Local Government Act and other existing legislative framework. Any material changes to strategic assets such as sale require consultation and LTP amendment as required by the significance and engagement policy. So that in and of itself provides one mechanism for protection. The second layer is to do with the policies that you have adopted earlier today in the long-term plan, the Auckland Future Fund policy and Auckland Future Fund distribution policy. As Ross mentioned before, you adopted them, and because they are part of the LTP, in order to amend them, you need an LTP amendment process or another LTP in order to do that. So that's another high level of protection. The one that you've been provided that's newer for today is the draft trust deed, which you're also being asked to agree to. That trust deed has a number of protections in it. So there are the standard terms that give the trustee, and in this case the directors of that trustee, the responsibilities to act in a way that complies with all of these other protections that are in place. And it gives rights to the trustees that put decisions at arm's length from councillors. It also includes terms relating to exceptional distributions, which Ross mentioned before. So based on legal advice, this is a stronger protection than if there wasn't to be no mention of any exceptional distributions. There's an extremely high threshold to make these distributions, which is requiring a supermajority of council. Those are all set out in clause 7.3 of the trust deed. There are also other so-called entrenched terms in the trust deed which require a 75% supermajority, which include terms around the beneficiaries and the purposes of the trust. So again, some quite high levels of protection set out in that trust deed. Alongside that is the appointment of professional independent directors. So that, as Ross mentioned, was discussed at the Performance and Appointments Committee on Tuesday, and was decided that those directors must have strong experience of financial markets and in managing and governing very large investment portfolios. So with a level of independence and expertise that those directors will bring, that provides another protection. There are also the CCO accountability measures that you're familiar with, things like, as Ross mentioned, the statement of intent, regular reporting to governing body and relevant committees, and performance reporting against the statement of intent, and other things like Legoima provisions. These are also set out in the trust deed at clause 8.2, so just so there's no doubt as to how they apply. And last but definitely not least, the legislative protection. So the draft legislation, which is also before you for decision today, it takes key terms of the trust deed and puts them into a legislative form. So those two documents are consistent. It provides for independent investment decisions, and it enshrines that 75% supermajority requirement as well, in order for any actions to be taken around the fund. And because it will be legislated, obviously it will be very difficult to change it. So I've tried to come up with an analogy of how all of these different mechanisms work together, and in a nod back to the earlier presentation around COVID protections, they work in a way like having perhaps a mask, a vaccine, and social distancing. They're not the same things, they're separate things, but when you do them all together, they provide a very high level of protection. In terms of the resolutions, as the Mayor noted, there are a number of them, and they work in parts. So the resolutions, the first one is noting the resolutions that you passed on the 16th of May. The second lot of resolutions in B are to do with all the protections that are in place around the fund. The third item C are the things that we are seeking your approval of today, being the trust deed, the responsible investment policy, and approving the transfer of the airport shares into the trust. D is then specific resolutions that relate to the promotion of the Auckland Council Future Fund Bill in order to achieve that statutory protection. E provides delegations to the Chief Executive to carry out all the further preparatory work. And the Mayor mentioned that there is an additional recommendation as well, and that is that we provide progress updates on the establishment of the fund to the governing body. So we're almost there, final slide. Just, you've seen this before at the workshop, the indicative timeline. This is also set out in the report in the table at paragraph 55. We've obviously have made a lot of progress in terms of drafting all of these policies, the trust deed, the local bill, and commencing the appointment process already. And the next few months will be continuing that preparatory work to get the fund structure in place and get those directors appointed. And I will leave it there, and we're happy to take questions.
Any questions? Who's first? Wayne Walker. Mike Lee and Wayne Walker and Chris Darby.
Thank you. Can we go back to the first slide? protections. Okay, protection mechanisms. Categorisation of the fund as a strategic asset. Remind me, was not Auckland International, the shares of Auckland International Airport considered to be a strategic asset up until 30th of June last year? Is that correct?
Yes, any equity investments in airport are designated as strategic assets by legislation.
So it was, and then suddenly it wasn't. Okay.
Well,
in terms of...
Well, it means that it is deemed a strategic asset. That means that if you want to make any changes, you can only make changes or sell them by way of an LTP amendment.
The question was it a strategic asset until 30th of June last year? And the answer, I think, was yes, right?
Any shares
yes
owned,
or no, please.
So any shares owned by the council are a strategic asset. Once you sell the shares, it's no longer a strategic asset.
Okay. CCO accountability measures, are they the same accountability measures required of, say, Panuku or, say, of Auckland Transport?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, not reassuring. Can I just make one comment here? The graphic seems to depict a whole lot of ordinary Aucklanders holding up as offerings our public assets. Is that right? There's support, is it the airport? Not a very encouraging symbol, to be honest with you. It looks like, hello, international corporates, come and take away our publicly owned assets. That's what it looks like. Very revealing.
Okay, Councillor Walker, your question.
Well, I've got a few questions. I was just looking at the trust deed, and it covers off a couple of things. One being protecting the real value of the fund, protecting the real value of the fund. So, am I correct in assuming that protecting the real value of the fund includes the value of the fund enhancing with inflation or other criteria, but also that it includes an increase in the value of the fund?
So by the real value, we mean protecting it for inflation, so that the value of the fund is maintained and grows at the 2%, which is the current long-term inflation rate. So it's about keeping it constant, but growing with inflation, so it isn't diminished. The value isn't diminished over time purely because of inflation.
Right. So I understand that, and then the other aspect is fund services and infrastructure of Auckland Council. And I just take that as read. So the concern that I've got is that given that, yes, we want to protect the value of the fund, but in addition to that, we actually want to grow the fund against a background where there's a competing interest of money going to Auckland Council to fund services and infrastructure. How do we get on in respect of actually growing the fund over and above inflation?
So the fund is set up through the distribution policy in the LTP and the assumptions in the LTP around a return after transaction costs of 7.24%. So that is the long-term expected average rate of return, and it's based off historic averages for an 80% growth, 20% income allocation of capital. So because the long-term inflation, the growth in the fund that you're trying to achieve is 2%, that means there is 5.24%, the difference that can be distributed to council. And so the setup here is that the distribution policy provides for that 5.24% 5.24% to be distributed each year as a regular distribution to council, just like the airport shares return a consistent dividend. And that should, over the long run, allow that fund to grow at 2% over time to maintain that value. In any particular year, there'll be good years, there'll be bad years, there'll be lots of volatility, so things will move around. But over the long run, we expect that that should be able to achieve that long-term rate of return. Through the trust deed, the trustees will be there to give advice and to make sure that over time that fund will grow in accordance with that target.
Okay, so I understand that. The distribution policy that's mentioned in the trust deed is outside the trust deed. So that's council's direction. That direction is capable of change. So we could have a circumstance where the distribution policy says to the trust, yes, you'll comply in terms of real value. That might be the rate of inflation, but we want everything else, in which case the concern that I'm expressing is that the fund doesn't grow over and above real value, which is, let's say, inflation. That's correct, isn't it? So we're heavily reliant on the distribution policy of Auckland Council.
Thanks for the question, Councillor. So that's correct what the distribution policy allows for, and the way that that distribution policy can be amended through an LTP process. However, the purposes of the trust, which are both to protect the real value over time and also provide a return, they are enshrined in the trust deed as well, which is much harder to amend, and they are also in the proposed local bill, which will again be extremely difficult to amend. So there are additional layers of protection there where the directors will have to follow those purposes in any of the decisions that they make.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, I don't recall seeing any information in the trust deed about the return. Correct me if I'm wrong. So is that somewhere else?
Yeah, kia ora. The distribution policy is locked into the trustee by reference, and I'll get my glasses on, clause 7.1.
I understand the reference.
Yeah.
7.3D, no, sorry, that's something else, but carry on. Yeah.
So any change to the distribution policy needs to go through the LTP gateways and the trust deed gateways. So if there was an attempt to get more distributions than are proposed today, that would engage all these other protections, and you would have more hoops to get through to do that.
Is that the exceptional distribution we're referring to?
Yes, and there's a similar equivalent process if you try and amend the deed to do the same thing.
Sure, so my question is not around the exceptional distribution, I understand that.
Yeah.
My question is around the trust deed and the fact, and I suggest it is a fact, that the amount of fund, the real value of the fund could be constrained to just real value, and that the fund doesn't grow over and above that, because the council could exercise its influence to require all the returns other than real value to fund services and infrastructure.
So my understanding, and Bram can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is the council could try to do that, but the trustee, the directors of the trustee would say, oh, if you a move to do that would be inconsistent with the purpose of the trust, as set out in the trust deed, of maintaining or growing the real value over time. So if the council was to try to get regular distributions that meant the fund was not keeping up with inflation, it would be inconsistent with the trust purposes, and the directors of the trustee could decide, not to support that, and they'd be backed up by the trustee, they'd be backed up by the legislation as well. So that is part of the constraint there.
So through you, my concern that I'm coming back to is that we're actually interested in the fund retaining more than simply the real value. We're interested in the fund growing more than that. But we don't say that, we don't cover off that, other than the assumption that the distribution policy that isn't in the trust deed reflects that. So that is my concern. Is that not a fair concern?
There are provisions for the fund to be, the real value to be maintained or grown. And there are also resolutions that refer to and the investigation into being able to put other assets into the fund as well to grow it. So it is open to being able to be grown, but there is also, I guess, another purpose, which is to make some returns as well. And it will be the responsibility of the trustees to weigh up those things in accordance with the distribution policies that get set.
Okay, in which case, can you show me where the reference is to, in the trust deed, to any reference or grown? Because all I see is real value. I mean, if I'm incorrect, then, that stands.
The wording in the policy and the trust deed refers to protect the real value of the fund, etc., and that followed from the earlier resolutions and perhaps consultation documents. There is probably a short answer to this. These protections are there to preserve, at least as a minimum, the real value of the fund. If council, in its mind, were in the future to be less demanding of distributions, then it could relax that. But the point is these are to ensure that it at least maintains the real value of the fund over time as the absolute minimum, and that's what we've locked in. There's nothing stopping you putting more money into this trust in the future if you want to.
Okay, so through you, if I can apply a test here, so let's say we've got the fund, let's say on day one, the fund's got so much money, and then let's say the fund does well, and the fund grows, okay? And it grows more than real value. So then you've got a quantum of money which is real value plus more. Then let's say a council, a few years into the future, decides, okay, we want some money. Yes, the real value of the fund needs to be retained. It goes back to the original value, accumulates the real value, which is essentially the rate of inflation, and then says, okay, we've got $1 billion here, we want that now, we're compliant with the trust deed in terms of real value, but we're going to take the rest. There's no safeguard around that as far as I can see in the trust deed. So I'm just raising that as an issue because worst case scenarios do come to pass, particularly with councils, because councils come and go. So a related question then is there a way to safeguard that?
Councillor, the documents that are prepared are consistent with the decisions that were made on the 16th of May and the purpose that is set out in those documents.
That really doesn't answer my question, but I'm just raising something that's of concern.
Look, I might be missing the point here, but if you wanted it to grow at a faster rate, then you would have made a different decision in the long-term plan, and you would have had to raise rates higher than you did.
That still really doesn't address the issue that I'm raising, which is an issue in principle.
Except I may have misunderstood the point then.
Okay, so my concerns.
It's okay.
My concern still stands.
Doesn't surprise me.
So the other question I've got is just around 7.3D4, Roman numeral 4, and that's around the distribution, and it goes to other funding options. I'm making the assumption, but I'd like to be assured that implicit in under other funding options is the scenario where the council goes to government first, and that might be around a severe event or the like that has occurred. So other funding options encompasses government.
Yes, I think that's our understanding is yes, it includes that. So the idea is that the council should look at all other available options, including going asking the government for funding before it can. And if it hasn't adequately explored those kind of options, then this would mean you can't look at it. The idea is that this using distributions from the fund should be the last resort, not the first resort.
Okay, and the last question I've got just goes to the management of the fund, which could change over time. So in a situation, let's say, where interest rates have come down significantly, so the council's cost of capital is more economical, but the prospect of returns on investment is comparatively high, is it conceivable that in the council's investment policies, distribution policy, that we could then consider putting more money into the fund by raising some debt? Is that conceivable within the trust deed and the investment policies and distribution policy?
In terms of the structure of the fund and the trust deed, it's open to the council to put more money into the fund from whatever source at any point in time. So there's nothing that restricts you to put more money into the fund. I guess our advice would be borrowing money to invest, would not be, prudent financial practice. But there's nothing in the structure that that prohibits or restricts you from putting more money into the fund.
Councillor Darby, please.
Thanks, Mayor. Can we address the responsible investment policy at this stage? Is that appropriate? Now's the time? Yep. So just on that, can you just take us through the process of how we have reviewed that policy? I know New Zealand super funds use an independent external party to vet companies. Like there's actually a real structure in place. I think they use ISS from memory. So I'd like you to just take me through how we've updated that policy with what's known in the world of institutional investment, equities investment today. I notice the exclusions don't extend to a general exclusion of munitions and arms. It refers to cluster bombs, which are a category, but there are new categories of really destructive, ugly weapons appearing in modern wars right now that could be added to that. So my second question is, why not exclude munitions and arms full stop? And also companies that failed to provide modern slavery statements. I think there's many investment advisors now that are demanding modern slavery statements from companies. Have you considered that? And then the responsible investment policy for environmental, social and governance also has an emphasis on governance. Some companies are poorly governed, where labour practices are poor, and there's very little transparency in some companies. So I'm just wondering if you could address those areas for me, please.
I'll ask John Bishop to come and provide some advice as the expert on this.
Thanks for the question through you, Chair. I guess the first point is that we can exclude anything you'd like to from the investment policy. Where best practice is developing in this area is that the list of exclusions is usually limited to what is illegal. And the modern idea is that you allow your investment manager to still invest in companies where you might not totally agree with the ESG practices, and allow their influence from being a shareholder to try and change that company's behaviour. So you're working from within rather than working from without. Now that doesn't mean if you don't succeed you might end up selling that holding, but that's where modern practice is going. That's why you'll see from the previous two responsible investment policies we had, the latter one had fewer exclusions than the earlier one.
Okay, so you're saying that a fund manager that the directors and the fund managers that are employed by the directors of the Auckland Future Fund would be putting in place that, and we could influence companies that do have bad practices. But there are some bottom line bad practices that need to be identified. Modern slavery is, in my eyes, a bottom line. Auckland Transport has modern slavery as a bottom line, because modern slavery is not just in other countries, it's actually in this country as well. So I would suggest that a bottom line exclusion is not investing in companies that cannot provide a modern slavery statement. That is a document which most listed companies, the big ones all around the world, are very aware of now. Yeah. Can we comment on that particular exclusion, please?
Through you, Chair, look, we can easily add that exclusion if you'd like. Again, the risk is that the more you open it up, everyone's got their own particular views on alcohol, gambling, and you get a longer and longer list, which makes it a lot harder for the investment manager to actually successfully invest in funds which can meet those objectives. And I think you'll notice now in the responsible investment policy, it is on invest in endeavours basis.
I'm not sure how to handle this, Bear, but maybe we haven't sort of canvassed that investment policy. Maybe I haven't canvassed it as well as I should have previously, but I think it does need a thorough look at. I'm not sure whether this forum is the place to give it a thorough look at. And I'll take your guidance on it.
I think you raised some good points there, Councillor, and I think the appropriate time would be at the time that when we're asking the people to appoint whoever the fund manager turns out to be. And I think that that's something rather we should be looking to have ethical investment. I don't think anyone wants to do this unethically. So we'll get through this, and I think that at the stages where we're looking to the future appointments, that should be something we have a discussion about.
So from memory, can I just check? We've had a lot of workshops. Do we have a workshop on the responsible investment policy? This is the first time that the draft has come.
It was covered last week. We covered as part of
okay. And my apologies. So if I've missed it, I'm doing the catch up.
If I can just maybe help a little bit. So what the policy does is it sets out, in addition to the bottom line exclusions, it sets out general principles about ethical investment and calls out the environmental, social and governance requirements. So it's basically setting up those key principles, and then you will be, giving direction to the directors to follow that. There's a requirement for them to report back at least annually on how they're going with that. So it's about setting the directions for them, and then you holding them accountable to their performance in that space. In terms of the exclusions, it excludes certain things, but there's also an exclusion in there about anything that would be illegal if it occurred in New Zealand. And then it's got other things in addition to illegal things, so like gambling, and tobacco is not illegal, but it's ruled out in addition to things that would be illegal if they occurred in New Zealand. So things perhaps like modern slavery would be illegal if it occurred in New Zealand. So that those things would be covered under the exclusions already.
But I'm not sure.
Quite happy to call it a a workshop at the appropriate time to go through these.
To confirm the policy.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to do that.
It's probably better than here.
Yeah, I think we're arguing about something which we haven't quite got yet. And we're not arguing, we're debating. I don't have any problem with where you're going on this at all. I mean, it has to be seen to be an ethical investment. I mean, there are lots of people who don't think aeroplanes are very ethical. So I think we've got to get this right. So thank you very much for that input, and I'm certainly taking note. It'll be minuted. Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Chair. At this stage, 2 questions, but there was one question that was raised by Councillor Walker to the team, and I just wanted to get it clarified again, is that if the future fund doesn't do well, Ross, I think your response to Councillor Walker was that your advice would be not to top it up through debt. Can I confirm that?
So the expectation is that over the long term, the fund will maintain its value with inflation, so it'll achieve like the 2% return. There will be bad years, there'll be good years, and so we wouldn't look to make changes to top up or withdraw funds from the fund. It'll be a volatile fund, it'll go up and down. But the idea is the fund will continue and it'll keep making distributions as long as the directors are satisfied it can still achieve that long-term return and grow at least by inflation. So it's not a question of taking action whenever there's a good year or bad year. It's about having people that look after that fund, protect that fund in real terms, and make sure it will maintain its value and cover inflation over time.
Ross, I thought the question that Councillor Walker asked was whether they would top it up with debt, and your response was that your advice would be no. Can I just confirm that? Because I think, I'll go back to the tape, but I think your advice was no. Can I confirm that? Because with the answer you've given, you sound like one of us, politician.
So the question was, can the council add more money into the fund, and including borrowing money and putting money into the fund? The answer is the structure of the fund lets you put money in at any point, and whether you borrow for that money or sell assets or get it from any other source, the structure of the fund doesn't specify that. Nothing blocks you from putting money in. Our advice is, as a finance team, would be not to go and borrow money and put it into the fund. We don't think that would be prudent financial management. But there's nothing in here that stops you putting more money into the fund at any point.
Just to add to that, what Ross says is entirely correct. The feedback from the credit rating agencies is quite clear that if we are swapping one form of financial investment for another, which is essentially what we're doing in this case, they don't see any problem with that. But if we were to go out and borrow, let's say, additional funds to put into the fund, they would see that as quite a negative from a rating point of view.
Okay, got 2 more questions, Chair. Might be to the CEO. Phil, are we still looking at $500,000 to set this fund up?
I think there or thereabouts, Councillor Filipaina. I had 400 in my mind, but you're in round terms, you're right.
Okay, and the last question to you as well, Phil. How are we tracking with the work that was recommended, I think, through the either budget or governing body meeting around what other funding mechanisms or assets will go into the fund? Are we still tracking on the same time frame, please?
I think the time frame was within 12 months, if I remember correctly. We've started discussions, but I'd have to say that the priority has been on getting the trust deed established. All of the machinery around this has been the priority for the team. So there's more work to do, but yes, we will be on track in terms of giving advice to you in that 12-month timeframe per the earlier resolution.
Kia ora. Thank you, team.
Councillor Flitch, please.
Thank you, Chair. In Life Ideal, it would have been really good to have perhaps had all of the documentation for the trust in place, but we don't have the luxury of that, as it's been explained to me by the CEO, in terms of the commitment that we've got to deliver the LTP. So my question really relates to the draft statement of investment policies and objectives that are expressed in the draft trust deed that we have before us. And that really relates to what funds managers and the investments policy will have about short and medium term investments, and what the likelihood of those might be that they can be realised should they be required, and what the implication of that might be for New Zealand-based investments vis-a-vis international investments, given that we may need to draw down on funds if there's a disaster in Auckland. So what advice have the officers received, and from whom, on that particular matter?
So we've, I guess, a number of answers. So we've received, legal advice on the structure and how it all works. The SIPO is a critical document, and it's up to the directors of the trustee to prepare that and to work through that. One of the, and it's kind of standard practice for these funds to have the SIPO and all of the matters that you've talked about. In terms of risk and types of asset, all those things, where geographic split, those are important things to be worked through with the SIPO. So it will be a document that the directors of the trustee will need to make decisions on. They will need advice from investment managers, and it'll be up to them to get that advice. Now, one of the tricky bits in terms of the setup is what do we do? How do we get that up and running quickly? I had a discussion with John Crawford yesterday, who has been involved with establishing some of these things, and in particular monitoring these kind of funds. A good chat around what all of these elements and how we might go about it. And he was just really encouraging us to be thoughtful, make sure we set it up right, and make sure that those we have advice in place to make sure that the directors are well advised. They're ready to go, and that we get things set up on the right way. So I think all the things you've talked about are the key things, and we're going to have the good, well-qualified directors, and we're going to make sure that they are well advised, and then they have access to good advice on all those matters.
So within the draft trust deed that we've got before us, a statement of investment policies and objectives designed to further the purpose of the trust based on council's guidance having regard to responsible investment policy and so forth. These are going to be reported back to the governing body on a regular basis. Am I right in that assumption?
Yes, that's correct, Councillor, that document will come through to the governing body for review.
Thank you for that, because we have actually had a discussion in and around council's investment policy, but it strikes me, and I'm sure that Councillor Darby would like to contribute to that, that these are matters that need to be updated regularly. He highlights armoury and so forth, but I might have a view about the appropriateness of some pharmaceutical investments. We all might have views on that. So I think it is important that we do have clarity and a very clear brief on what we want within that. So I appreciate your confirmation of that, and just repeat that it would have been perhaps, if speed were not the essence here, that we had a lot of these things locked in. Is the timeline that you have suggested realistic? Are you concerned about it?
It's fair to say the timeline is challenging, but I'm very pleased with where we've got to in the space of time we've had since decision making on the 16th of May, and so I believe it is achievable.
And Councillor
And can
Fletcher,
you
if I
give
can,
us-
oh, sorry, Councillor
No,
Fletcher, I was
just
just
go.
going
No, no.
to add that there is a resolution added today which obliges us to bring progress updates on the establishment through to the governing body to the point you're making. So, it'll be formally resolved as such.
Thank you for that. Perhaps the other matters that I've got, which do relate to the draft trust deed and the distributions policy, these can be finalised a little later, and I can perhaps address those in my comments.
Thank you for that input. Councillor Watson, please.
Yeah, just a couple of questions on the draft bill. And there's a process to go through there, of course. So has it got to the stage yet where there's been any assistance or review sought from the Parliamentary Council Office?
Through the chair, thank you for the question. We haven't quite got to the point of any engagement with. We've had an initial engagement with both Parliamentary Council Office and the Clerk of the House, just to let them know that we're looking at it and that they can expect a draft from us in the very near future, but we haven't yet sent that to them. We have had a meeting with a government MP who's indicated that they would sponsor the bill, so it's very much in train, and we would be looking to send the draft to Parliamentary Council Office early next week.
Okay, yeah, because that's what's recommended in their advice, isn't it? So as far as that, we haven't then started in any of the preliminary procedures, that would have come after that as it goes to, notice of intention and persons with a direct interest, etc. Just on that question of persons with a direct interest, who would you envisage that involving in the case of this bill?
So the parliamentary standing orders are quite prescriptive, and that's part of the reason why we would engage with the Clerk of the House to make sure that we're covering off all the requirements in that regard. But it is quite prescriptive, and it includes all members of Parliament in the relevant region, so all Auckland-based members of Parliament and others that are set out in the standing orders. So it's not so much the public notice is more the notice to the general public, and then those specific people are those set out in the standing orders.
Okay, a question on point 7C1, this clause here, the council may only depart from the principle in subsection B, and this goes to this 75% threshold. At least 75% of the council's governing body resolves on reasonable grounds, and it's very clear from that generalised wording that that governing body could make all the usual justifications, as indeed it has done in the past in respect of paying down debt or installing infrastructure or whatever. That would all get captured by that. So in the governing body, that would mean in practical terms, and that's probably more meaningful for people around here, there'd have to be 6 people who opposed it, wouldn't there, numerically?
So just to be clear, that would be a 75% majority of those present and voting.
Yeah.
So it would depend on the numbers of members that are there.
Let's take a full house on an important matter like that, would be 6.
Yes, if I'm not great with numbers, which is why I'm a lawyer and not an accountant.
Yeah, well, it's you don't get whole people when you do it on a strict 25-75 split. Just as a point of interest to the other members, the last time a fund like this came along, exactly the same sort of fund really, but in real purposes, diversified assets portfolio, did it get to that 6 threshold? This is back in 2017. If we're thinking of the 75% as being like a magic number that provides greater protection.
I don't know the answer to that, councillor, without going back and checking.
Yeah, I do though. It only got to 5, but as we were advised, there wasn't a full house on that day. But so it happened the last time. So 75% wasn't a foolproof protection in effect if there's a full turnout. Going forward, I guess the first question people would also ask is, we're going through this local bill process. If a future council chose to, downgrade that 75% to say 51% or whatever, then they would just go through this process again, wouldn't they?
Yes, so if a future council wanted to look to amend that legislation, which would be a local act, then yes, it would follow the same process, and that process would require that legislation to pass through Parliament again.
Okay, thank you. I reserve my right to speak on this, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Ferry, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify something. We've gone back and forth a little bit on the responsible investment policy, and I just have 2 questions that I'm hoping will just tidy things up a bit. The first is, do we review our current policy on a regular cycle? And if we don't, how do we trigger a review of that policy?
Yeah, through you, Chair. The responsible investment policy that related to the self-insurance fund was reviewed annually or more often as required. And I think, again, that's sensible because it's still very much an evolving area. So it's something we'd regularly want to have a look at and adapt as required.
Okay, and what's the process for that? Does that come to Rev?
Through you, Chair, that would come back for approval to the governing body.
Okay, so your idea, Mr. Mayor, I was about to call you Your Honour again, sorry, that we have a workshop to do a bit of a deep dive on that. I think, yeah, that sounds like a good way forward. Can I just check then? So if we pass this as it is today and we make future changes to that responsible investment policy, whether we add or subtract things, because I think Councillor Fletcher's right, there's probably, and Councillor Darby, there's an appetite probably to have pull some things in or out or whatever. Will we have to change anything, or will that automatically apply to the future fund? Or do we have to recommit to it, or do we have to change the deed? Are we wording this in a way that means that it will just automatically reflect the current policy?
Yes, that's correct.
Right,
so
thank
we have said this is the policy for the council. It will apply to the Auckland Future Fund, the Self-Insurance Fund and any other investment funds that the council may have.
Great, thank you.
Question, Councillor Foley, please.
Kia ora. Thank you, Chair. Look, I'm just picking up, I heard someone say, one of the officers say, that this bill would be extremely difficult to amend. So I just wonder if you would be able to qualify that and explain what in the bill makes it extremely difficult to amend or different from any other statute that exists. Because I'm looking at the proposed bill now and I don't see any entrenching provisions in it that would prevent any future Parliament from amending any of those provisions or repealing the provisions, or even from repealing the Act in its entirety, assuming it becomes an Act. So I wonder if staff could just respond and answer that question. Is there anything in this proposed bill that would in fact make it extremely difficult to amend by any future Parliament? Kia ora. And I may have a follow-up question.
Through the Chair, and thank you for that question. No, there's nothing in this bill that would make, once it passes, that would make it any more difficult to amend than any other piece of legislation. There's no proposal that this piece of legislation in itself be entrenched. It's just the fact that it is legislation that gives it that extra layer of protection, that it is something that Parliament would need to amend as opposed to a future council seeking to amend it.
Kia ora. Thank you, Chair. No follow-up.
Councillor Walker for another one.
Sure, so just got some very quick questions here. So they follow on from my earlier questions. So just in the bill, it says so that the Auckland Future Fund maintains or grows its capital base. Would not maintains and as compared to or be better and be more in line with our intention for the fund?
So the intention and the stated purpose of the fund and the decisions made through the LTP was to have two purposes: to provide a return to council and to grow the fund over time in real terms. So the drafting there reflects the trust deed and the resolutions
So that is
made.
correct. So in just your statement just now, you used the word and rather than or. So if that is the case and that is our intention, shouldn't the word here be and rather than or?
No, I mean, so the resolutions that you passed as part of on the 16th of May in terms of long-term plan decisions making was maintaining or increasing the real value of the fund. So it's definitely an or based off your governing body resolution.
Okay. The other question I've got is, have we run this through our audit committee or the council's auditor? Just a yes or no. That's all I'm after.
So the elements related to the long-term plan have all been part of the audit process. Elements that go to the bill and trustees are kind of that's about implementing the plan. It's outside the scope of what the auditors would look at. So they've looked at all the bits that are relevant to the long-term plan as part of the audit of the long-term plan.
Okay, and just the last question, in this explanatory note, we mention the history of the diversified fund, its value at the outset, 260.5 million. We don't mention its value at the end. Would not that be useful for completeness, because it generates some ramification that in many respects we should have held on to the fund? Would that be useful?
In reviewing the bill, we have recommended that that paragraph be removed. It reflects a political statement as opposed to explaining about what the purpose and policy statement is of the Auckland Future Fund.
But it's in here now. So is that recommendation contained somewhere that we remove it?
So staff have continued to be working on refining and making some edits to the drafting of the bill since you've been provided with it. We have a delegation for that bill to be finalised by the Chief Executive. We will provide you with the final version of that bill in due course.
That being the case, I just voice my concern that I actually quite like it, and I'd suggest it could be expanded on, because the loss of that diversified fund has cost us dearly. I mean, to a significant extent, and I think it is relevant and has merit.
Councillor Leone, please.
Kia ora. I'll try and make mine very brief. Just want to start off first because I haven't heard anything around your consultation with mana whenua or iwi on this. Just also wanting to note around the appointment in professional independent directors and acknowledge that obviously there was an attempt to put up an amendment around having a Māori board member, which didn't go through, which is fine. I mean, that went through that process. But if we were to ever review that in the future through this, what would be the time frame for that to happen?
In terms of mana whenua, Marawaku engagement, that was all part of the long-term plan. So there was extensive consultation on the concept of the future fund, set up of the trust and the airport shares, as well as the port option. So all of that was canvassed as part of that. I'll let Alistair talk about the other part of the question.
Through the chair, in terms of appointment of directors and to what sort of makeup and criteria you're looking to there, whenever you make any appointment to the board of this entity, it's free to the appointments committee to set whatever criteria it likes at that time. So it's an ongoing review.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, I guess, you know, my query was around if we ever wanted to actually set a seat for a specific Māori person, which I know has been raised in other forums, and I'm not likely to get that support around this council table here. But I mean, basically, it's just going to have to go through appointments committee.
That's correct.
Thank you. I do note that Te Hakura voted for the LTP to include the fund.
Yeah,
Righto,
I'm talking about besides just those ones, the trustee appointments. But that was my main question. And also just the only other thing that I wanted to get an idea on was how often we're going to be getting an update as governing body on the progress.
Quarterly.
Yeah, it's quarterly, and it'll be in a resolution coming to you very shortly. Quarterly to the GB. Okay, that's the end of the questions. Please retire. We'll open this up for debate. I think already Councillor Watson wanted to have another go.
Has it been moved?
Yes, it has.
Councillor Fletcher and then Councillor Watson, I think.
Thank you, Your Worship. I want to really pause and reflect on the significance of today. Very rarely do we have the opportunity for those of us in the chamber and those of us online of really signing up to something that's significant and of enduring purpose to Aucklanders. If I think back on my own involvement with Auckland, I think of things like Britomart. I think of things like the day we signed up to the CRL, and then again today. And so at one level, I feel very positive about today, providing, you know, the devil's in the detail, providing we get the detail right. But I think it's important that we reflect on the background to this. When you assumed the mayoralty and you wanted to get stuck into selling some airport shares, I will admit to being one who was fiercely opposed to you because, and I had to really stop and think about it. Why was I so opposed? I think it was the cynicism I felt that assets of Auckland had just been squandered in the past. And I really drill down on myself to say, well, is it just my affection, abiding affection for the Auckland International Airport and my frustration that we hadn't provided good stewardship for those shares? Or was it just the fear that the funds would be squandered? And in the consultation that I did with others, there was this common theme of just fear that funds would be squandered. I was very grateful, therefore, when you picked up the suggestion at the end of that annual plan that we actually looked at some sort of investment strategy. And to a degree, you know, we've been very lucky to have the support of a number of people, and including the staff in your office. And I want to acknowledge Max Hardy, I want to acknowledge Jazz Singh, and those who worked tirelessly on this. As we worked our way through, there was the decision not to include the lease of the Ports of Auckland in it. And the advice that we received from people like Simon Allen and John Crawford has been invaluable for me, because it really is a measure of incredible disappointment that we've had this gap for a few years from under the Gough Council, where there was the disestablishment of the CCO, Auckland Council Investments Limited. But really, this today and what we're doing is not just going to be another CCO. This today is going to be giving the assurance to the people of Auckland that the sole purpose of this fund is to be there for them for the future. And we just can't allow it to be politicised. We just can't allow it to become top heavy. And we really have to have a very clear investment strategy and understand the purpose of this trust. There's still a little bit of concern you're hearing expressed today about exceptional distributions, and I think that they are right. And I don't have the great comfort in relying on what happened in New Plymouth that some others have. We are not New Plymouth, and New Plymouth has not had the experience as Auckland has done on selling in a very controversial way a whole range of things. But this is a positive today. This is the opportunity that we can look back on perhaps in history and say, well, we were part of it, that this fund, which is going to be there for our children and our children's children, that will actually give some resilience to Auckland, is going to be, I think, of a lasting legacy for you, sir. So I just want to thank everybody who has been involved with it. I'd particularly like to acknowledge the staff in your office and John Crawford, but the work is just beginning. I've already indicated that I think that the timeline is very challenging, that I would normally have wanted to have a lot of this already tidied up so that we knew exactly, the brief is always the most important thing, and that we don't yet have the trust deed locked down is a bit of concern to me. However, I acknowledge the support of the CEO, and I want him to be reassured that I accept his explanations around some of this in terms of the need to get the LTP better done. Anyway, I'll conclude now, but again, just on thanks and to say this is a momentous occasion, and I really welcome it, and thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. If it's going to be around for our children, our children's children, it's going to have to fare a little bit better than the last fund that was of a similar ilk. And in that respect, I want to address the recommendations B in the report, which provides for the strict protections over the fund assets agreed to. The first one, the categorisation of the fund as a strategic asset. The airport shares were a strategic asset. The first round of airport shares, they went pretty quickly. The inclusion of key policies in the long-term plan 2024-34 that restrict decision-making, such as the special consultative process. And I know Councillor Lee's brought it up innumerable times. There's nothing really too special about the special consultative process. It just goes out with the annual plan or the long-term plan, and it can just be one amongst many things that are in there. And being one amongst many things, it's subject to the usual presentation of these assets as if they don't go or they don't do what they want, i.e. sell or transfer, then the result will be higher rate increases or cuts to council services. That was what was, so that's what's put up there. So that's not all that high a bar to get over either, as we've found in recent years. The third provision that's outlined here is the draft trust deed, and that's pretty generic. That's in there, as indeed is point 4, the appointment of professional independent directors and exercise of CCO accountability measures. Well, what do we have in the last CCO and investment entity at the council, the ACIL? Well, we had people like Simon Allen, Chair of Financial Markets Authority, Chair of NZX. We had Miriam Dean, who did the CCO review, King's Counsel, Chair of the Banking Ombudsman, 40 years of commercial litigation. Well, they were pretty professional and they were pretty independent, and they got the chop. They were out the door too. So, sorry if I sound a little bit cynical, but when you analyse those strict protections, they haven't proven too strict in the past. In fact, they've proven rather lax, in fact. Similarly, so if you want to take comparisons, I heard someone saying, "Oh no, this is a different fund than the last one." Well, no, it's not. It's actually pretty similar sort of fund, pretty similar in all respects. So if we look at Council ACIL, which the first thing you notice, we're talking about it in the past tense, because back in 2017-18, it was disestablished. And it sounded eerily similar to the entity that we're recreating here, had a strong commercial focus to the ownership and management of council's investments in Ports of Auckland, AIAL, an efficient structure for the ownership of these assets. Its role is to maximise the contribution to the Auckland economy and provide substantial financial returns, which are financially sustainable in the long term to the council. So it had all the same properties as this entity that's getting set up here. But if you really want to get to the heart of the matter and why people shouldn't be quite so assured as this paper would suggest, I would suggest you go back to the agenda items that inform the decision to disestablish ACIL, where it was said by expensive consultants we paid for, EY and Cameron Partners, it was noted that the rationale for holding a diversified assets portfolio is weak, and it is unusual for an organisation with the objectives of Auckland Council to hold such an asset. And that staff agree with EY and Cameron Partners. So that's what they were saying a couple of years ago. And further to that, the rationale for holding the diversified asset portfolio looks even weaker than the rationale for holding the Auckland International Airport shares. Auckland Council could divest its interest in this fund and reinvest the proceeds in paying down debt, reducing rates, or accelerating infrastructure investment. So we're now getting told the opposite. So just within the space of a couple of years, if it fits the narrative, the whole story just flips, and there's absolutely nothing to stop that happening in the years to come up. In fact, if you're a betting man, you'll be betting on the past, on track records, not kind of empty, shallow assurances. And the other component to that is the personnel who sit around this chamber, because a lot of them are the same people who have a track record of selling down valuable public assets. There's a couple of new people, some of whom have made bold statements like, I didn't come into local government to sell off public assets, before going on to do just that. So I would say if I was an Aucklander out there, I wouldn't feel any more reassured about this than I would with what happened to the diversified assets portfolio. And for perhaps the one or two councillors I am addressing here, there's an old saying, my final words: fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
And of course, we voted against. So.
Councillor Turner, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will remember this day as a day I had some learning. I just sat here and listened to all this and realised I shouldn't have voted yes, because we're going to spend more money managing this stuff than we've got. Since the vote went through, I've sat in workshops and we've had flow charts of all the decision making. Today we talked about, but then I'm just a member of the public trying to grapple with this stuff. All I ask, Mr. Mayor and Mr. CEO, is we keep a focus on what we're trying to do. We keep it simple and sensible, and let's not try to turn it into something political. What my family told me when I was a kid was household chores. Some of my grandkids tell me is now modern slavery. So, we need to we're here to make money. You said, Mr. Mayor, you sell things to make money, and that's what the people of Auckland need us to have, is money to keep this city running. So I'm not against doing it properly and virtuously, but we have to do what the task is, and that is get this thing profitable.
That's the point of it. Well done. Thank you for that. Councillor Filipina.
Thank you, Chair. We've rushed into it. I was part of the political working group. We've rushed into this. I just want to acknowledge Councillor Watson with what he's just given. We've rushed into it. There was an opportunity to wait at least that year. So then we could end up looking at whether it be the airport shares or all the others to come in. I think one councillor said that, look, it's a shame that we haven't got the papers here today. And, you know, but look, we need to sort of just carry on and everything else. But look, strategic asset, read the report. That makes no difference. It's not going to make any difference. It's a strategic asset. So I'll be definitely voting against it. The other issue, I think, for me is that, and it got mentioned today around the lease of the ports, we know why that was taken off the table. There were 11 councillors that were going to vote against the lease of the port. So we know why they got taken off the table. So look, I know there's a division called for it, so I'm going to keep on fighting for the strategic asset, even though this one here is going to be an issue. Kia ora.
Councillor Lee, please.
I'll be brief, Mr Chair. It's fair to say that the council's track record on protecting assets is not particularly strong, is it, really? And I think we all must admit that. And what happened to the diversified fund assets is a glaring example. The expert advice we got on that and the advisors are similar, include similar names to the people who are now advising us on the so-called future fund. I recall not so long ago, during the annual plan process, which was in full flight by the time we were sworn in, amounted to endless briefings at great length about our financial situation and the solution. And every briefing, every workshop, and they went on for a long time, concluded with the advice, we have to sell the airport shares to solve our debt problem. And in the end, we sold half of them to solve the debt problem. It was termed as reducing the debt or reducing borrowings. And when you think about it, they're not quite the same thing. Reducing debt is one thing. Reducing borrowings means you don't have to borrow because you can spend cash already that you have from selling stuff like the airport shares. So now the whole rationale is different. No mention at all. No interminable briefings about the need to pay down debt. No, this is about the future fund. No one had heard of it a few months ago, but now it becomes an absolute imperative for this council. Given all the other problems we have, it's all about the future fund. Mr Mayor, councillors, we have to get our stories straight here. Why are we selling these assets? You can't have a diametrically different reason to sell airport shares from one year to the other. It's just not credible. So what's the real reason? The real reason seems, unfortunately, a long-term agenda to sell our public assets. And going back to Cameron Partners' report in 2015, it appears to have been an article of faith within the council that we must sell our publicly owned assets. And I have to say, I don't think we have complied with the Local Government Act processes in regard to this matter. I see there's a reference in an early report on the Electoral Act, which says in an amount of words that anyone who has a view can expect to get a hearing. We haven't had proper hearings for the public during the annual plan or during the long-term plan. We have cherry-picked spokespeople or groups to come along. We haven't heard from the general public in the old way the conventional way of a public hearings, of councillors being accountable to the general public, to the people of Auckland. So that is a real concern. I think our decision-making process is judicially reviewable, unfortunately, and I think that this is a fundamentally bad decision. You'll be aware that myself and Councillor Watson have had cause to complain to the Auditor General in the way we have been advised, in the way that consultants have been paid, and those payments have been accounted for, and the nature of those payments. I won't go into any further detail about that, but it seems to me there is a connection between the means and the ends, and I have to say, given our track record on asset sales, the means seem to be as unethical as the ends, and that is a problem. Asset sales are deeply opposed by the people of Auckland. However we spin it, it is causing major dysfunction and a political split, a bitter political split in the Wellington City Council. There's been major problems in Christchurch, which thankfully have decided not to sell assets, but the public hate selling public assets. But the picture the staff put up that went out in the long-term plan is very, very revealing of a way this council thinks. Here is the people of Auckland depicted as ordinary folks holding up their assets, the assets that were handed down to them and should be handed down to their children and their children's children, holding them up for international corporates to come and rip off. That's the problem, and that's why I oppose this future fund. It is not being dinkum. It is not an honest reason for it. It is a pretext to sell public assets, and I oppose that.
Councillor, Deputy Mayor Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. This is about establishing an Auckland Future Fund. It's about taking $1.3 billion of money we have in one particular portfolio and getting a higher level of return for it. We are not selling 1.3 billion, we are just getting a better return for the money that is on offer at the moment via the airport shares. I'm a huge fan because I want to see the best return for that 1.3 billion. And if that means potentially selling some of those airport shares and having another portfolio that delivers a higher level of return, why wouldn't we do that? For the councillors from Auckland City Council and Manukau, there is $20 million in there that will be invested in those two former cities, as a sweetener probably, for want of a better word. And I applaud that as well. We voted on that on the 16th of May. But I just want to focus you on the fact that you sit round the table here making a decision that does the very best for the ratepayers of Auckland. And what this does is it brings in more money so we are less reliant on the ratepayer. That's what we're here to do. Do more with what we've got. So I will be very happy to support all the recommendations. Thank you.
Henderson, sorry.
Just a little one, Mr. Mayor. Look, this is a vote that will grow our capital position and grow our investments. As I've said before, we have never actually reinvested. We have never grown our shareholding since the start of the Super City. We've never done it. This will be $200 million approximately over 10 years that will be held as capital. That's 2% going back. It'll also be $400 million over the 10 years. Extra public revenue for Aucklanders over 10 years. Earlier today, we heard about pool use is up, park use is up, library use is up. All the civic things that we need to fund, all that use is up. And that's because when times are tough, people need those public services more than ever. And as I've said 100 times, that's what I ran on, And that's the mandate that I got from my community to protect those public services. They need things to be cheap or free, especially when they've got kids to entertain at home, right? And so for us to leave that money on the table, that would be irresponsible, in my view. Voting this down means less protection for that capital that we're going to pass on through the generations. We'll pass that on. We'll pass on more dividends to our community through the generations as well. We'll pass that on. It's a reinvestment from a position in one company to a position in many companies, which means less risk, it means more protection, it means more money back for Aucklanders. Voting this down means less protection from capital, it means less public investment. So therefore, I'm happy to support it, and thank you so much, Mayor.
Thank you very much for that. Councillor Furley.
Kia ora. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Your Worship. Look, I just want to tautoko a lot of what's been said by some of the past councillors before me. I do want to say too that this is, for me, a very sad day. It is a date in history, as others have said, but it's a sad day in history because we are letting go of that last piece of public ownership of our biggest asset and the asset that currently earns us the most in revenue. So I'm really, picking up on some comments that others have made, because there's no guarantee that moving that investment into this future fund will actually provide a better return. There's no guarantee that it will make more money. But what we have seen in the past is that this asset has delivered for us over time, time and time again. It certainly did for Manukau City Council. The reason why Manukau City Council has a library, has a pool in every subdivision was because of the money we were able to get from the airport shares. And past mayors of Manukau have said to me that the shares were a license to print money, in their opinion. So in terms of less risk, while the airport shares is less risky than the future fund. But Your Worship, I just wanted to highlight issues around the lack of protection for this fund. I'm not convinced that this is a fund that will be there for my grandchildren. I think that this fund will probably last 3, perhaps 4 terms. And some around this governing table may not be here then, but I expect to still be here, and my grandchildren certainly will be here when I think a future council, a future parliament will probably dissolve this fund. The fact is that it can be dissolved by simply going under the Trust Act. The beneficiary by consent can do that. They can just write a letter to the trustees and demand that it be dissolved, or go to the High Court and seek an order to do so. Or they can just get Parliament to amend some of the provisions, or just repeal the whole Act in its entirety. And we've heard from staff that that's absolutely possible now. So I'm not convinced that those protections are solid, and certainly the same protections that were there for the airport shares mean that it's not solid at all. I'm also disappointed, Your Worship, because during those debates previously and during all the workshops, we were told that the details around the trust deed, the details around how this fund would be set up, would be something that we'd be involved in more. But I'm disappointed that we haven't really been able to have much say in how it's being set up. We certainly haven't been able to guarantee any seats, 1 seat out of the 3 in terms of the director for Māori. And I'm not confident either that in a rush to maximise profits, that we're not going to invest in areas of concern, areas like gambling or mining or other things that might not protect our planet, or might even seek to exploit our planet for profit. So I'm not confident in this fund at all, Your Worship. And just lastly, around that $20 million, I'm thankful for that. But again, no clear process. We asked the staff about that because the local boards have been scrambling to try to get some of that very small bucket of money. But there is still no clear process. And really, it's just crumbs when you consider that the local boards in Manukau and Auckland City Council have already given up, $833 million worth of an asset that they once owned, and $20 million is just crumbs, really, in comparison. That's all I'm going to say, Your Worship. Obviously, I'm going to vote against it. Kia ora. And I'm calling a division. Kia ora.
Councillor Ferry, please.
Oh, that came quick. Thank you. I wasn't going to speak, but I do just want to address two issues quickly. One is that I want to reiterate the point I made at the last governing body about this, that we are again debating, and I'm glad no one has put up any amendments, but we are again debating without our haukura representatives on this issue when we did work through it with them at the table at Budget Committee. And so I just remind people of that anomaly, that when we talk about things like wanting Māori to have a seat at the table, a guaranteed seat on any trust, then we should be consistent, I feel. And I wish they were here, but they're not. The other thing I wanted to mention was just in regard to the legacy fund. So obviously that is something that local boards have been asking about. We had some discussion with some of the local board chairs at the drop-in session that was held, in which they were able to attend, and they asked about that. There was an undertaking at that time from the staff that once we have voted for the fund to exist, which is what we are doing now, yes, the future fund, but also the $20 million legacy fund, then they will be able to swing into action and put in place a process. So this is the normal order of events with that kind of thing. So I did just want to reassure people on those 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Good points raised. I wouldn't mind having Te Hukura here either. Councillor Hills, please.
Thank you, Mayor. It was just a few. Sorry. I don't know who that was.
The DCSB checking on you.
All good. It was just a few comments, and the first on ACIL. I mean, that was consulted on at the time to disestablish, to bring us closer to the ports of Auckland, to give us planning, strategic, basically control over the ports of Auckland, and give us the ability to point and remove the trustees on the ports of Auckland. And that was because we were concerned about the safety, we were concerned about decisions such as automation. When we asked those questions, we couldn't get answers. We were concerned about a lot of things, and the reason that it was consulted on through the LTP at the time to remove ACIL and give us that closer proximity to the ports was to change that. And did that change? Yes. The board changed, the CEO changed, and now look where we're at, because we did not want to lease out the port. We are now far closer. The relationship with the port is really good, and we're going to see some significant increase in dividends as well. On the future fund itself, of course, I would support this. This obviously makes the fund far safer with the 75%. At the moment, the airport shares can be sold at just a simple majority. This obviously protects this long term with a far greater protection, and of course creates that $600 million extra in funding, which I was quite shocked at when we first brought that forward, but it's clear through audit that that is fairly normal figures. It could go up and down. And then of course the fund will increase on its own, but adding that 2%, that 20 or so million a year, will be a significant way to obviously keep ahead of inflation. So I'm supporting this. I'm glad that the staff worked to ensure that the responsible investing rules that we passed in 2022 will be at least the strong foundation for the investing around fossil fuels, around weapons, around gambling, and the other one, illegal activities. That's a good starter, but obviously more work to do on that as well. So yeah, I think this is a good way forward, and thank you to everyone who's worked on it.
Okay, thanks everybody for that debate. I'm going to have a couple of words because I haven't said anything all day about this. But we've heard a lot about democracy. 180,000 people voted for me to do sensible business things. It's 4.5 full Eden Parks. And this is a sensible business thing. We're not selling anything, we're just taking a dud and turning it into something that performs better. We had huge public support for this. It sounds as though a lot of you don't like public support. It sounds as though a lot of you have got no confidence in the future of the council. Councils are generally pretty sensible. They learn from mistakes. It was clearly a mistake when they did the ACIL thing. People have learned from it. And so I'm going to put the vote. It's been asked for to have someone asked for a division, always do. So we're going to vote on this now. Please carry the vote out, please, Sandra, with an R.
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor Baker.
For.
Councillor Bartley.
Against.
Councillor Dalton.
4.
Councillor Darby.
4.
Councillor Ferry.
4.
Councillor Filipina.
Against.
Councillor Fletcher.
Yes.
Councillor Foley.
Against.
Councillor Henderson.
4.
Councillor Hills.
Yes, thank you.
Councillor Lee.
No.
Councillor Leone.
Against.
Councillor Newman.
Yes.
Councillor Sayers.
4.
Deputy Mayor Simpson. 4. Councillor Stewart.
4.
Councillor Turner.
Yes.
Councillor Walker.
No.
Councillor Watson.
No.
Councillor Williamson.
Yes.
Mayor Brown.
Yes.
So that is carried. 14 votes to 7.
Righto, thank you very much. The next item is a summary of governing body information memorandum and briefings. Thank you. All those in favour, please.
Simpson Walker.
In favour? Contrary? Okay, now we've got consideration of extraordinary business. Josephine Bartley, who hasn't done herself any good in the last minute, but she's going to have a go at this now. I've just lost my generosity, I'm afraid.
Oh, that's all right. I had a PowerPoint, but I know it's been a long meeting, so I'm not going to do it to you guys. I did have a talk to Phil Wilson, and he was suggesting a report to go to PEP regarding how council could assist in the food shortage crisis that we're about to face when our major food banks will take their funding cuts from the government, meaning a very, very limited amount of food parcels will be provided to people. So, yeah, that's it. I'm not sure.
Well, just to say, I think this is entirely appropriate. I mean, not without getting into the issue, there is a problem. Significant funding's been withdrawn. The city mission provides for food parcels through a number of other outlets, food banks in the city. So I totally understand why Councillor Bartley has raised it. We'll do a little bit of work and direct some advice through to Councillor Hill's committee.
Could I ask a question of Joe? So, yeah, definitely support this. This is, we'll work together on this. Joe, thank you for bringing it forward. My question, and I just want to clarify, how much is the cut to the city mission, the government's cut?
So the city mission need 1.5 million to continue providing 50,000 food parcels. And the government has said they'll fund them 75,000. So because of that major cut, they're not going to be continuing with their Food Link program, which supplies food parcels to 50 organisations throughout Auckland and some marae. And also they're cutting the provision of food parcels that they give out to about 20,000. Not only them, but there are also Village Trusts, has 8,000 families, and they're cutting it down to 200 parcels, food parcels a week. You've got Butterbean, who's been in the media about how they're going from 700 food parcels to 200 food parcels a week. And then you have the other smaller food banks that are just going to close up. So there's a crunch on those organisations that do provide food parcels, that have government funding. They can't really continue the same way they continue. The ones that don't get government funding can't cope with taking on the extra from the ones that the government's cut the funding to. So there's a lot of bad outcomes that come when people are unable to access food. And I don't want to be crass and say crime will increase, but you already see the supermarkets talking about how thefts have increased significantly, and they're worried that it's going to get even worse. So,
Good. Mayor, would you and Councillor Bartley, or I'm happy to help, be able to write to the government in the meantime before this can come back? So, you know, it may be they may have overlooked this issue or something. It might be good just short term get a letter out.
I'm happy to explore the issue further. I have had a bit of a problem with City Mission. They're taking a lot of money off the government for accommodation for people and not providing any support whatsoever. They've had huge damage which they've inflicted on K Road and without any responsibility at all. So the problem about the food thing I get, I'm not sure whether City Mission is in fact the correct organisation to share it with. But I'm quite happy to take up the challenge of looking into this and seeing if there are solutions, in much the same way as that I've used my quite a chunk of my budget for funding street patrols and other things in terms of looking after the safety and security of the city as well. So there's pressures all over the place. And it kind of shocks me that 7 people voted against something which would have increased the rate burden to everybody in Auckland. And then turning around saying those other ratepayers have got to cough up somehow or other to feed them. I think you should have a close look at your own morality, those 7 people. That's why I'm going to finish on that.
Mayor, I don't think there's a connected.
Okay. We've got to move to go into confidentiality now, and I think this is a reason for being into confidentiality. I hate going to confidentiality, but I will support a vote to do this. Moved by Newman and seconded by Baker. In favour? Okay, thank you. Thank you for the public who managed to stay all day long, both of you.